For 8 years, a name I didn't recognize showed up on my bank statement every single month. $300, then $500, then $1,000, always from the same source, always with the same memo line that said only for May. I never knew who sent it. And then one morning, a lawyer called to tell me that the woman behind those transfers had died and left me her entire estate, $11 million. I had never once met her in my life. I should tell you what my life looked like before that call, because context matters here. You can't understand what $11 million means to a person unless you understand what that person's mornings looked like before it arrived. My name is May Colton. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my adult life I have lived in Roanoke, Virginia, in a rented duplex on Callaway Street, with a landlord who took 3 weeks to fix the heat and a parking lot that flooded every time it rained harder than a drizzle. I work as a records coordinator at Carilion Clinic. It's not glamorous work. I sit in front of 2 monitors for 8 hours a day processing patient documentation requests, and I'm good at it in the way that you become good at anything you've done long enough that it stops surprising you. My mother, Helen Colton, lives 40 minutes away in a senior apartment complex in Salem. She raised me alone after my father, Dennis Colton, died of a stroke when I was 9. He left behind a paid-off Chevy pickup, a fishing pole I still have somewhere in my storage unit, and a life insurance policy so small it barely covered the funeral. My mother worked school cafeteria jobs for 22 years after that. She is the toughest person I know, and she has never once complained about any of it. Not to me, anyway. That's the background: rented duplex, flooded parking lot, steady job, weekend visits to Mom, a cat named Pepper who knocks things off the counter at 3 a.m. and shows no remorse. The first transfer came in October of 2015. I noticed it the way you notice most small anomalies in your bank account, with mild alarm that lasted about 48 hours before the next thing in life took over. $300, deposited on the 14th. From an account I didn't recognize. No institution name, just a routing number and that memo line. For May, I called the bank. They confirmed it was a legitimate transfer from a private account. Intentional, not a glitch. I spent about 2 weeks trying to figure out who sent it. I went through the mental list of every person who might randomly wire me $300. A relative I'd lost touch with, an old friend who owed me money, someone from my father's side of the family I barely knew. Nobody fit. And then the next month it came again, and the month after that. By the 6th month, I had a separate savings account where I put every single one of those transfers. Not because I was noble about it, but because spending that money felt like spending something I hadn't earned. It sat there, accumulating. $300 a month for the first 2 years. Then in 2017, it jumped to $500 without explanation. In 2020, during the worst of everything, it went to $1,000. I remember staring at that deposit on my phone screen in my car in the clinic parking garage and thinking, whoever this is, they know something is hard right now. I don't know why I thought that, but I did. 8 years, 96 months, somewhere north of $68,000 sitting in an account I called privately the Mystery Fund. I hired a private investigator in 2018, a retired sheriff's deputy named Carl Briggs, who charged $400 up front and came back to me 2 weeks later with nothing useful. The account was registered under a trust in Delaware, a wall of legal privacy I didn't have the resources to climb. Carl gave me back $200 of the $400. Said he didn't feel right keeping it for empty hands. I stopped investigating after that. I kept saving. Then, on a Tuesday morning in April of 2023, my phone rang while I was eating cereal at my kitchen table. A number with a 540 area code. Roanoke, a woman's voice, precise and unhurried. "Am I speaking with May Colton?" "Yes. Mrs. Colton, my name is Judith Harrow. I'm an estate attorney with Harrow and Finch in Roanoke. I'm calling regarding the estate of Mrs. Opal Whitfield, who passed away on March 29th. You've been named the sole primary beneficiary of her estate. I knew the name the way you know the name of a city you've never visited. It meant nothing to me, and yet something in the weight of it made me put down my spoon." "I don't know an Opal Whitfield," I said. "I understand," Judith said. She anticipated you might say that. She asked that I tell you this when I called. She was Dennis's friend. I sat very still. Pepper walked across the table and put her face close to mine, the way cats do when they sense something has shifted. "My father," I said. "Yes. She was a close friend of your father's for many years. She's named you as her primary heir. After taxes, legal fees, and several smaller bequests she specified, the estate available to you is approximately $11 million. I looked at the window. It was raining. The parking lot outside was already starting to pool. "Miss Colton?" "I'm here," I said, and I asked if I could call her back. I drove to my mother's apartment that same afternoon. She was in her kitchen making soup. And when I came in without calling first, she looked at me the way mothers look at you when they already know something's wrong. "Mom," I said, "did Dad ever mention someone named Opal Whitfield?" She turned off the burner. She did it slowly, deliberately, and then she turned around, and I saw something in her face I hadn't expected. Not confusion, something older. Something like a held breath finally being released. "Where did you hear that name?" I told her about the call. I told her about Judith Harrow. I told her the number. My mother sat down at her kitchen table and pressed both hands flat on the surface like she was making sure it was still there. "Opal," she said, mostly to herself. "Then, your father grew up on the same street as her family in Staunton. They were close as children. She married young, moved away, made something of herself. She came to your father's funeral. I remember her. She was small, gray hair, wore it pinned up. She held my hand for a long time at the reception and said, 'My mother stopped.' Her eyes went somewhere. 'What did she say?' I asked. She said, 'Helen, Dennis would want May to be okay. I'm going to see to it.' My mother looked at me. I thought it was just something people say. It wasn't something people say. It was a promise. And Opal Whitfield had kept it, every 14th of every month, for 8 years, without ever introducing herself or asking for a thank you or explaining herself to anyone. I met Judith Harrow at her office 2 days later. She was in her mid-50s, careful with words, the kind of lawyer who lets you catch up before she moves on. She laid the estate out plainly. Opal Whitfield had been the sole owner of a regional textile supply company she'd built in the 1990s, sold it in 2011 to a national distributor, and had lived quietly on the proceeds since. No children. 2 nephews, her late sister's sons, named Preston Whitfield, 44, who managed a commercial real estate portfolio in Charlotte, and Kyle Whitfield, 41, who lived in Knoxville and ran an online auctions business. Both had received specific bequests, $50,000 each. She left me everything else. Judith slid a small sealed envelope across the desk. Opal had asked that I read it alone. I read it in my car, parked on a side street near the office with the engine running and the rain tapping at the windshield. Opal's handwriting was neat and small, like someone who'd learned to be economical in everything. "May," she wrote, "your father was one of the most genuinely good people I ever knew. We lost touch over the years the way people do, and I have carried regret about that. When he died, I was sitting in that funeral home thinking about what his little girl was going to grow up without, and I made myself a promise. I've kept it the best way I knew how. I never reached out directly because I didn't want to make you feel watched or obligated or like you owed anyone anything. You owe me nothing. I simply believed your father deserved to have his daughter looked after, and I had the ability to do something about it. That always felt like sufficient reason. I held the letter in my lap for a long time. Outside, a dog walker in a yellow raincoat passed the car with 2 retrievers, completely unbothered by the weather. Sufficient reason. 8 years of monthly deposits. $68,000 saved because I was afraid to touch it. An $11 million estate. All because a woman I'd never met decided my father deserved to have his promise honored by proxy. I called my mother from the parking spot. She answered on the first ring. "It's real," I said. "She wrote me a letter." My mother didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, very quietly, "That's Dennis. That's exactly the kind of friend your father made." She was crying. I could tell by the breathing. "She tries to do it where you can't hear." I told her I'd come by for dinner. Then I sat in that parking spot for another 20 minutes and thought about what comes next. What came next was Preston Whitfield. He called 8 days after my meeting with Judith. The number was a 704 area code, Charlotte. His voice was smooth and practiced, the voice of a man accustomed to negotiations across conference tables. "May," he said, as if we'd spoken before, "I think we should talk." He was polite on that first call. He expressed sorrow about his aunt. He said he respected that Opal had been generous to me. He used the phrase significant discrepancy twice in the span of 3 minutes. I asked him what he meant by it. He said he preferred to discuss it in person over coffee, like 2 reasonable adults. I said I'd think about it. I didn't think about it. I called Judith instead. She told me not to meet with Preston or Kyle without legal representation and not to agree to anything in any form by any channel. Then she said something I already knew but needed to hear from a professional. "They're going to contest this. Be ready." The contest came 14 days later. Preston and Kyle's attorneys filed in Forsyth County probate, citing 2 arguments. That Opal Whitfield had been diagnosed with early-stage vascular dementia 18 months before her death and may not have had testamentary capacity when she finalized her estate documents. And that a third party, specifically me, had exercised undue influence over an elderly and cognitively impaired woman. The implication being that I had somehow manipulated Opal into naming me heir. I had never in my life spoken one word to Opal Whitfield. I needed my own attorney. Judith represented the estate, which meant she had obligations to all parties. I needed someone who worked only for me. I found Terrence Molina through a referral from a paralegal I knew at the clinic, a woman named Sharon Briggs, who'd been through her own estate dispute after her grandmother died. Sharon handed me Terrence's card with 2 hands like it was something valuable. "He doesn't lose these," she said. Terrence Molina had an office downtown, 2nd floor, above a dry cleaner. His desk was covered in stacked files and one enormous coffee mug that said, "World's Oakiest Attorney" in chipped letters, which I found immediately reassuring. He read the estate documents while I sat across from him. He did not interrupt himself or make sounds while he read. When he put the papers down, he looked at me with the direct, slightly tired eyes of a man who had seen exactly this situation too many times. "Have you signed anything with the Whitfield nephews?" "No." "Made any verbal agreements?" "No." "Good." He set his hands flat on the desk. "Let's talk about what we have. We had 3 categories of evidence to build: medical records showing Opal's cognitive state at the time of the estate amendment, documentation of the transfers, 8 years of them, showing the pattern was long-standing, rational, and deliberate, and personal correspondence demonstrating that Opal's intention predated anything that could be called confusion. I left with a retainer agreement and a list of things to do, and the particular feeling of having a foothold after weeks of standing on ice. The medical records came first. Terrence's investigator, a methodical woman named Darlene Voss, who had done estate work for 30 years and moved like she had done everything 30 times already, pulled Opal's files through proper legal channels. What she found did not support the nephew's claim. The vascular dementia diagnosis was early stage, documented as mild. Opal's neurologist's notes from the period surrounding the estate amendment described her as alert, oriented, and capable of detailed sequential decision-making. She had managed her own financial accounts without assistance through the year of her death. She had renewed her car insurance, corresponded with her financial advisor about a bond rebalancing, and attended 2 meetings of a local historical preservation society. This was not the portrait of a woman who did not understand her own paperwork. Terrence called me on a Thursday evening. "Their capacity argument is in trouble," he said. "Opal's records don't hold it up. I was standing at my kitchen counter doing nothing in particular when he called. Outside, the parking lot was dry for once. What about the undue influence claim?" I asked. "That," he said, "is where it gets interesting." He paused. "We found a letter." Darlene had located it in Opal's personal document archive through the estate discovery process. A letter written to Judith Harrow 3 years before Opal's death. 4 pages, hand-dated, in Opal's small economical handwriting. In it, she explained the full history. Her friendship with my father, the promise she'd made at his funeral, the specific decision to provide support anonymously, and the reasoning behind naming me as her primary heir. She had laid it out with the kind of systematic care that does not come from a confused mind. Terrence read me a passage over the phone. Opal had written, "I have never introduced myself to May Colton, and I have deliberately kept it that way. My aim is not to create a sense of obligation or dependency, but to do quietly what Dennis would have done had he lived. She is not a stranger to me. She is the daughter of a man who deserved better than what happened to him, and that is reason enough for everything." I had to set the phone down for a minute. Reason enough for everything. I picked it back up. "That's the case," I said. "A significant part of it," Terrence said. "Yes, while Terrence built the legal case, I thought about my father. Not the absence of him. I'd spent years being comfortable with that absence, or at least functional inside it, but the actual person, the man that other people had known. I called my mother that weekend and asked her to tell me things she remembered about him, not about his death or the money trouble after, but about who he'd been before all of that. She talked for 2 hours. She told me about a trip they'd taken to the Outer Banks the year before I was born. She told me about the way he made breakfast, eggs every Sunday, always slightly overcooked, always served with too much pepper. She told me that when she was pregnant with me, he used to talk to her stomach, not words exactly, just talking, telling the baby what was outside the window. At some point, she pulled out a photograph. She texted it to me because she doesn't trust email. 2 people, young, maybe mid-20s, standing at the edge of a lake somewhere, squinting into the sun. One was my father, younger than I'd ever seen him in photos. The other was a small woman with dark hair and a big, unguarded smile. "Is that Opal?" my mother said. That's from before you were born. They were at a lake outside Staunton. Opal took that picture herself with a timer and a rock to hold the camera. I saved it to my phone. I looked at it for a long time that night. That smile, the particular ease of it, the smile of someone standing next to a person they trusted completely. Preston called again 12 days after I'd hired Terrence. This call was less polished than the first. He said he'd been doing some thinking. He said Opal had been a difficult person to understand in her final years, that the family had noticed changes in her judgment, that they were concerned for her when she was alive, and they were concerned for her legacy now. He said he believed a reasonable split of the estate, a third to me, a third to him, a third to Kyle, would honor the spirit of what Opal had wanted while also accounting for the reality of familial bonds. I asked him to contact Terrence Molina's office going forward. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "May, we're family. Opal was family. You're not." I said. She disagreed. "Goodbye, Preston." I hung up and sat with that for a minute. "You're not." Maybe that was true by blood. But Opal had spent 8 years quietly acting on a different definition of family, and she'd documented it, and she'd meant it. I wasn't going to apologize for that. 4 days later, Preston showed up at my office. I know, I couldn't believe it either. I was coming back from the break room with a cup of coffee when my coworker Dina Chu flagged me down at the hallway corner. "There's a man at the front asking for you," she said. "He says he's a friend." He was not a friend. Preston Whitfield was maybe 5'11", expensive haircut, the kind of blazer that suggests a man who thinks carefully about what his blazer communicates. He was standing in our waiting area with the specific stillness of someone who has practiced not looking impatient. "I was in the area," he said. "Nobody is just in the area in a medical records corridor on the second floor of a clinic annex building. You shouldn't have come here," I said. "I just wanted 5 minutes without the attorneys." I looked at him. He was doing the thing people do when they're trying to appear open. Hands slightly out from his sides, expression arranged into sincerity. I thought about Opal's letter. Reason enough for everything. "My attorney's number is on file with your attorney," I said. "Have a good afternoon, Preston." I walked back to my desk. My hands were unsteady. I texted Terrence from under my desk like a high schooler. Preston Whitfield just showed up at my workplace. He said he was in the area. Terrence responded in 11 minutes. Document time, location, duration, what was said. I'll file a formal notice with his counsel. This won't help them. Then he sent a second message. You handled it right. I put my phone face down and went back to my documentation queue. I processed 14 records before lunch. That's the thing about days when enormous things happen. The ordinary parts don't stop needing to be done. 2 weeks after the clinic incident, a certified letter arrived at my apartment. Inside was a printed summary of what Preston's attorneys were calling a promissory note, a claim that my father had borrowed a sum of money from Opal decades ago, an informal loan never repaid, and that as his heir, I might be legally responsible for the outstanding balance. The amount listed was $40,000. There was a handwritten note from Preston on his company letterhead suggesting that if I wished to avoid this additional complication, there was a straightforward path forward. I photographed everything and sent it to Terrence. He called that evening. "It's a pressure tactic," he said. "Informal personal loans between friends from 30 years ago with no documentation don't transfer to heirs as legal liability in North Carolina. There is no promissory note in any of Opal's estate documents. If such a loan existed, she forgave it long ago. That's actually the cleanest interpretation of 8 years of regular financial support." He paused. They're trying to make you afraid." "It's working," I said. "That's fine," he said. "Let it work a little. Just don't let it change what you do." I had someone in my life who made that easier to say than it sounds. Her name was Dina Chu, my coworker, who'd flagged me down in the hallway the day Preston showed up. We'd worked together for 4 years, but we'd only become actual friends in the past 2. She was 35, sharp and funny, the kind of person who notices things without making a performance of it. She'd noticed I was quieter than usual, that I was taking phone calls in the stairwell, that I was eating lunch at my desk with my eyes somewhere else. One afternoon, she appeared at my cubicle with a bag of those little orange cheese crackers and put them on my keyboard. "I don't need the details," she said, "but you look like something's eating you, and I'm not going to pretend I don't notice." So I told her the shape of it. A woman I'd never met had left me something substantial. Her family was fighting it. I was in the middle of something I hadn't asked for and wasn't sure I'd get out of cleanly. Dina ate a cracker and looked at me for a moment. "Are you going to fight?" "Yes, good. Don't stop." She pushed the crackers closer to me. "Eat something." That was Dina. She became the person I texted when something happened. Not to process it out loud, not because I needed advice, but because having a witness to something makes it less lonely to carry. She'd reply with things like "noted," "still in your corner and they don't get to win," and once, after a particularly bad day, when Terrence told me the probate proceedings might be delayed by a pretrial motion, just a single "hold." She brought me a small jade plant from her windowsill a week after Preston showed up at the office. "For your desk," she said. "Something alive." I kept it. I kept it watered. The motion to delay the probate proceedings came from Preston's legal team on a Thursday. They wanted 60 additional days to gather supplemental evidence. Terrence opposed it the same afternoon and filed our counter motion presenting Opal's letter to Judith as primary evidence of testamentary clarity. Judge Walter Edmonds denied the delay motion. The proceedings would continue on schedule. Preston's next move was the most direct. I was home on a Saturday. Unusual for me, I normally spent Saturday mornings at my mother's. When the knock came, I opened my door to find both Preston and Kyle Whitfield standing on my front step. Kyle was shorter than his brother, softer around the edges, with the look of a man who had been talked into being here. Preston was in a gray jacket. He looked like he'd planned this. Kyle was holding a white paper bag from a bakery downtown. The details struck me as so off-script that I almost laughed. "We owe you an apology," Preston said. "Can we come in?" "You can say what you have to say here," I said. Kyle glanced at his brother. Preston's expression shifted, recalibrated. "We've been grieving. Opal was our mother's sister. We grew up at her house every Thanksgiving, every summer. This has been hard. I'm sorry for your loss," I said. I meant it. Whatever was true about Preston's tactics, Opal had been a real person in his life. That part was real. "We're not bad people," Kyle said. It was the first thing he'd said. His voice was quieter than his brother's, without the practiced smooth of negotiation. We didn't expect this. Nobody told us she was planning this." "She didn't tell yous," I said, "because it was her decision to make." Preston stepped forward. The bakery bag disappeared behind Kyle somewhere. "We're prepared to offer you $1.5 million. Final settlement, no further litigation. You walk away clean, today." I turned down Preston's earlier offer, I said. "The answer to $1.5 million is the same." Something shifted in Preston's face. The managed grief dropped off like a coat. "You're a records coordinator," he said. "You make $60,000 a year. You're paying your attorney out of savings. We have resources you don't. We can do this for 3 years. Is that a threat?" I said. "It's math." Kyle put a hand on his brother's arm. Preston stepped back. Kyle looked at me, and for a moment his face was just tired. A man who'd probably been in his brother's car for 4 hours and was beginning to wonder why. "May," he said quietly, "we have pictures of her. We have stories. We have 20 years of history in that house. You have a letter and a bank transfer. How is that right?" And here's the thing about that moment. It wasn't nothing, what he said. I understood it. Opal was real to them in a way she would never be real to me. Not as a memory, not as a history, not as a presence at the table. To me, she was a letter and 8 years of deposits, and a photograph sent by text message from my mother's old phone. But she had made her choice. With full knowledge of all of it, she had made her choice. Written it down, witnessed it, and trusted it to hold. "I understand why this feels wrong," I said. "I do." But Opal made her decision. She documented it. She thought about it for years. I'm not going to walk away from that. "You're making an error," Preston said. "Flat now, done with the pretenses." "Goodbye," I said. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway with my back against it. Through the door, I could hear them on the steps, and then on the path, and then a car door, and then nothing. My hands were shaking. Not from fear, exactly, from exertion. The particular physical sensation of having held something steady under pressure. I texted Dina. They came to my door. Both of them. I said no. She replied in 3 minutes. "Obviously you did. Dinner tomorrow?" "Yes," I wrote back. Then I went to the kitchen counter, where I'd printed and framed that photograph my mother had texted me. My father and Opal, young, squinting at a lake, completely at ease with each other, and I stood in front of it for a minute. "I've got it," I said, to both of them, to whoever was listening. Then I fed Pepper, who was yelling about something only she could see, and I made dinner. The hearing was a Wednesday in November. I drove to the courthouse in Roanoke the morning of. It was local, which felt almost strange, and sat in a hallway with Terrence for 20 minutes while he went through the order of presentation one final time. "Let the record do the work," he said. "If opposing counsel addresses you directly, answer accurately and briefly. No elaboration, no performance." And Preston is going to be very compelling about how much he loved his aunt and how worried he was about her judgment. Terrence closed his folder. "I'll handle Preston." Judge Helen Rafter was in her early 60s with short silver hair and the manner of a person for whom this courtroom was not theater. She'd reviewed the preliminary filings. She was not going to be impressed by performance. Preston and Kyle sat at the opposing table with their 2 attorneys. Preston was dressed with the careful precision of a man who'd thought about what he wanted to communicate before he put the clothes on. Kyle sat beside him, looking like he was waiting for a flight to be over. The first 2 hours were procedural. Both sides entered documentary evidence. Terrence introduced Opal's letter to Judith formally into the record. The opposing attorney objected. Hearsay. Judge Rafter overruled it, noting the letter was a witnessed and dated statement of testamentary intent. Then the medical evidence. Darlene had worked with a neuropsychologist named Dr. Francis Allard, who had reviewed Opal's clinical records and submitted a written opinion. Dr. Allard did not testify in person. Her opinion entered the record. The documented cognitive changes in Mrs. Whitfield's medical file are consistent with typical age-related variation and do not meet clinical thresholds for impaired testamentary capacity. Her financial decision-making in the 12 months prior to estate amendment reflects intact executive function. The nephew's expert, a Dr. Ramsey, testified that vascular dementia of any stage could theoretically affect judgment. Terence cross-examined him. Doctor, in your clinical opinion, did Opal Whitfield lack testamentary capacity? She may have experienced some impairment. That's not my question. Did she lack capacity? Yes or no? A pause. I cannot state with clinical certainty that she lacked capacity. Thank you. Nothing further. Preston took the stand. He was good. He spoke about Opal with warmth that I believed was at least partially real. The summers, the kitchen, the particular way she laughed, her habit of sending cards for reasons that weren't holidays. He said he had noticed in her final years a tendency toward what he called impulsive generosity toward strangers, an emotionality that hadn't been like her when he was younger. He said when she'd told him once that she had an old obligation she was honoring, he'd assumed she meant a charity. I never imagined, he said, and paused, that she would redirect the entirety of her estate to someone she had never met. Terence stood. Mr. Whitfield, you testified that your aunt became increasingly isolated in her later years. Can you describe a specific social engagement she declined? A hesitation. She stopped going to her garden club. When did that happen? I believe sometime around 2021. Terence placed a document on the podium. This is the attendance log from the Roanoke Heritage Garden Society. Opal Whitfield attended 15 of 18 meetings in 2022, and all 7 meetings in the first half of 2023. Is it possible you're mistaken about the timeline? I may have the year wrong. And is it possible you have other facts wrong as well? Objection. Sustained. But the moment had happened, and Preston knew it. I watched something fine-tune itself in his expression, a small recalibration behind the eyes. You stated you were unaware of any ongoing financial support Opal provided to the Colton family. Correct? That's correct. Were you aware that Opal made 96 consecutive monthly deposits to May Colton's account over 8 years? I was not. Over the course of those 8 years, did your aunt ever discuss her estate planning with you in specific terms? We discussed. She mentioned wanting to take care of family. Did she explicitly tell you that you and your brother would be her primary heirs? A pause. She implied it. She implied it, not stated it. That's right. Terence turned a page. I have here a letter your aunt wrote to her attorney 3 years before her death. In it, she describes her relationship with Dennis Colton, the reason she established the transfers, and her reasoning for naming May Colton as primary heir. She writes, May Colton is not a stranger to me. She is the daughter of a man who deserved better than what happened to him, and that is reason enough for everything. Terence looked up. Mr. Whitfield, does this read like the writing of a woman who was confused about her intentions? Preston looked at his attorney. His attorney looked at the table. Nothing further, Terence said. Kyle's testimony was brief. He was quieter than his brother, less prepared, and at one point, Terence asked him whether Opal had ever expressed specific concern about May Colton's welfare, and Kyle said, she mentioned Dennis once. She said she still thought about his family sometimes. He said it like he'd forgotten he wasn't supposed to. Judge Rafter said she would review all submitted evidence and issue a ruling within 21 days. I walked out of the courthouse into November air, cold and very clear, and called my mother from the bottom of the front steps. I think it went well, I said. She started to cry, quietly the way she does, the breathing through it kind. She kept her promise, my mother said. She did. Your father would have done the same for someone else's child, she said. That's just who he was. I pressed my hand against the cold stone railing beside me. I know, I said. The ruling came on a Monday. 21 days exactly. Terence called at 7:40 in the morning. "May," he said, "we won." I was standing at my kitchen counter with my first cup of coffee. Pepper was on the counter next to me, which I have told her not to do approximately 400 times. Judge Helen Rafter had ruled in my favor on all primary counts. The will was upheld in full. The court found no credible evidence of impaired testamentary capacity, noting that Opal Whitfield's medical records, personal correspondence, and documented social and financial activities during the period in question demonstrated consistent, unimpaired judgment. The court further found that the undue influence claim was entirely unsupported, citing, in particular, what the ruling described as a documented absence of any contact whatsoever between the beneficiary and the decedent, which it noted made the theory of influence logically untenable. Terrence filed the confirmation of judgment that afternoon. The estate transfer process began. Preston filed a notice of appeal within 10 days. I called Terrence the morning I heard. "Can they win?" I asked. "They can file," he said, in the same patient voice he'd used every time I'd asked a version of this question. An appeal requires demonstrating legal error, not disagreement with the outcome. They have no grounds. The appeals court dismissed the challenge in 48 days. But Preston and Kyle had already paid the cost of what they'd attempted. The litigation fees accumulated, the filing fees, the attorneys, the months. I later heard through Judith that Preston had settled a dispute with a business partner during the proceedings and that the timing had cost him. His reputation in Charlotte's commercial real estate circles had taken a small but real knock, not from the case itself, but from what the case had revealed about his judgment and his restraint. Kyle called me once, about a month after the dismissal. I almost didn't answer. When I did, he said only this: "I want you to know I didn't think we were right. He's my brother." He paused. "I hope you do something good with it." "I'm planning to," I said. Judith Harrow, called me the week after the appeal's dismissal with the final numbers. After taxes, after fees, after the bequests Opal had specified to a local literacy program and a domestic violence shelter she'd supported for years, the estate available to me was $10.8 million. I was sitting in my duplex on Callaway Street when Judith said the number. The parking lot outside was flooded again. The crack above the window was still there. I had not fixed it yet. I didn't know what to fix first. I know now. The first thing I did was move my mother. A ranch house in Salem with a real yard, close enough that I could have dinner with her twice a week. She cried when we walked through it. She stood in the kitchen for a long time, just standing there, and then she said, "Dennis would have liked this kitchen." "He would have made too many eggs in it," I said. She laughed. The real kind. I kept my job for 4 months while I figured out what came next. I wanted to, actually. I wanted to process 10 more thousand records and sit in my cubicle and let things be ordinary for a little while longer. Dina thought I was crazy. She also brought the jade plant from her windowsill back to my desk when I came back, without saying anything about it, just put it there. I established the Whitfield Colton Fund the following spring. Both names on it because this story required both names. It provides emergency financial assistance to families in the Roanoke Valley dealing with unexpected medical crises, the kind that leave children without a parent's income before anyone has figured out what to do next. The kind of situation that my mother navigated alone, without a Opal Whitfield in her life, for 22 years on a cafeteria salary. I bought a house in Roanoke. A brick house on a tree-lined street. The parking doesn't flood. I had the kitchen painted the color my mother suggested, a pale yellow she called morning. The photograph of my father and Opal at the lake is framed in the hallway. It's the first thing you see when you walk in. Visitors always stop and look at it. They always ask who they are. My father and his friend, I tell them. They grew up together, and that's the truth. That's the whole truth. Two people who grew up together, stayed connected across decades and distance, and all the friction of ordinary life. And one of them, the one who had more and who remembered and who kept her word, made sure that the other one's little girl was okay. She never asked me to know her. She never asked me to be grateful. She just kept her word every 14th of every month for 8 years, quiet as breathing, until she couldn't anymore. And then she made sure I'd be okay for the rest.